The bowl hit the tablecloth first, and I remember thinking in that frozen half-second how strange it was that I noticed that detail before I noticed the heat. It was my mother-in-law, Patricia's prized soup tureen, the expensive one she'd imported from Italy last year, and it shattered against the mahogany table with a sound like breaking glass. But the soup, God, the soup was what mattered. It was still boiling when it hit my chest, soaking through my white blouse, and I could feel the burn blooming across my skin like something alive and hungry. My sister-in-law gasped. Someone dropped a fork. The whole dining room seemed to freeze in that moment, like we were all characters in a play who'd just missed our cue. Patricia stood there, with her hand still extended, trembling slightly, her face twisted into something so ugly that for a moment I didn't recognize her as the woman I'd known for 14 years. That's when she said it, that sneer on her face, that voice dripping with venom like poison from a snake's fang. "Try me again," she hissed. "Try me again." Like I'd done something to provoke her, like I'd been aggressive, and she was defending herself, like I was the one who'd shown up to a family dinner with a pot of boiling soup and a willingness to use it as a weapon. My husband, James, was sitting directly across from me. I watched him look at his mother, then look at me, and I saw the exact moment he made his choice. He looked away, not just looked away, but looked down at his plate like nothing had happened. Like his wife wasn't sitting there with scalding soup dripping down her stomach. Like his mother hadn't just assaulted me in front of his entire extended family. And then, unbelievably, horrifically, he said, "Mom, that was a little much." Not, "Are you okay?" Not, "What the hell is wrong with you?" Just, "That was a little much." Like she'd been rude at a party, instead of throwing boiling soup at me. That was the moment I understood something fundamental about who my husband was. Not the man I'd married 15 years ago, but the man he'd become. It wasn't a sudden realization. It was more like the final brick in a wall I'd been building for years, brick by brick, incident by incident, each one a small betrayal that I'd excused and minimized and rationalized away. I didn't make a scene. Maybe that was my mistake, or maybe that was what saved me. I sat there for a moment, feeling the soup cool against my skin, feeling the sharp sting of burns spreading across my ribs. I looked around the table at the faces of people I'd spent nearly a decade and a half trying to make happy, aunts and uncles and cousins, people I'd cooked for and sent birthday cards to and listened to for hours as they complained about their jobs and their kids and their lives. People I'd driven across the city to help when they needed something, and not one of them said anything. Not one of them looked at Patricia like she'd lost her mind. They just looked uncomfortable, like I'd spilled something embarrassing instead of being assaulted. I excused myself quietly. I stood up, pressed a napkin against my chest where the soup was still dripping, and I said, "I need to clean up. Excuse me." Even then, even in that moment, I was being polite. I was smoothing things over instead of screaming. I was taking responsibility for making everyone else comfortable by removing myself from the situation. That's the thing nobody tells you about being married to a mama's boy. It's not just that they side with their mother in conflicts. It's that they've trained everyone around them, including you, to accept their mother's behavior as normal, to excuse it, to pretend it didn't happen, to move on like nothing had transpired. I left the dining room and went upstairs to their guest bathroom. That was Patricia's house, not ours, which made it even worse. We were guests in her space, which meant she controlled the rules of engagement. I sat on the edge of her white marble bathtub, and I cried. Not because of the burns, though those hurt. Not because of the humiliation, though God knows there was plenty of that to go around. I cried because I finally understood that I'd wasted 14 years on a man who would never, ever choose me over his mother. Not because of her, but because of him. Because he didn't have the spine to stand up to her. Because he'd never taught her that there were consequences for treating me like garbage. Because he'd actually, in his own way, encouraged it by accepting it so passively. When I went back downstairs, about 10 minutes later, James was clearing plates like nothing had happened. Patricia was telling a story about something funny that happened at her book club, gesturing expansively with her hands as if she hadn't just tried to scald me. The rest of the family was laughing politely at her story, and it was like I'd imagined the whole thing, like I'd invented a scene that never happened. My white blouse was ruined, my skin was red and blistering, and everyone at that table was acting like it was just another Thursday night dinner. That night, after we drove home in silence, James told me I was being oversensitive. He said his mother had just lost her temper, that she didn't mean to hurt me, that I should apologize to her for whatever had upset her so badly. I asked him what I'd done to upset her. He couldn't tell me. Nobody could. As far as I could tell, my only crime was existing while married to his son. But that's where this whole nightmare started, really. The soup was just the final breaking point, the moment when I stopped making excuses and started actually looking at my marriage. And when I looked back at the 14 years we'd spent together, I realized there was a pattern so clear and so obvious that I could only blame myself for not seeing it sooner. I married James at 28 years old, and I married him believing that he loved me more than anything. He was charming and funny and successful, and his family seemed warm and welcoming. His mother, Patricia, appeared to be thrilled about our engagement. She threw me a bridal shower. She helped me plan the wedding. She seemed genuinely happy that her son had found someone to love. I was so naive. I thought that warmth was real. I thought that welcoming feeling would last forever. But the truth was, Patricia had been assessing me from the moment James first brought me home. She was evaluating whether I would be a suitable wife for her son, and more importantly, whether I would threaten her position as the most important woman in his life. From the very beginning of our relationship, there were small things, tiny, subtle things that I might have dismissed individually, but that collectively formed a pattern of control and manipulation. When James and I would make plans, Patricia would call and ask if he could help her with something, and he would drop our plans without hesitation. If she asked what time we were having dinner, she'd show up unannounced. If I tried to decorate our apartment, she would comment on how much better things looked with her aesthetic guidance. These weren't major invasions, not at first. They were small enough that I could pretend they weren't happening. They were subtle enough that when I tried to mention them to James, he would make me feel like I was the one being unreasonable. "Your mom called during dinner again," I'd say. "Why would that matter?" he'd ask. "Because I wanted to spend time with just you," I'd say. He'd look at me like I was asking him to choose between her and me. "She's my mother," he'd say. Like that explained everything. Like that made it okay for Patricia to interrupt our meals, our conversations, our intimate moments. Like his mother's needs would always supersede mine. He'd absorbed that from her so completely that he didn't even see it as unusual. To him, it was just normal family dynamics. The first real fight we had about his mother happened about 6 months into our marriage, and it should have been the moment I woke up and realized what I was dealing with. His college roommate was getting married, and the wedding was on a Saturday. It had been planned for months. I had a dress. We had confirmed with the groom. And then, 3 days before the wedding, Patricia told James that she'd scheduled a birthday party for her book club at her house that same day, and she expected him to help her with the setup because her husband was supposed to be working but had called in sick. She didn't ask if it was convenient. She didn't apologize for the timing. She just announced it like it was a foregone conclusion that James would cancel our plans to serve his mother's needs. I was furious. I remember standing in our kitchen, hands shaking, while James tried to explain that he couldn't let his mother down. "She's counting on you," he said. I pointed out that his friend was counting on him too, that we'd made this commitment months ago, that his mother is a grown woman who can hire a catering company or hire someone to help set up her own party. "I can't do that," he said. "My mother would be hurt." And that was it. His mother's hurt feelings mattered more than his commitment to his friend. They mattered more than my feelings about the situation. They mattered more than anything else. We didn't go to the wedding together. I went alone, and I spent the whole reception explaining to people why my husband wasn't there. The best man looked genuinely hurt, and I could see the moment he realized that James was the kind of person who would bail on his closest friends for his mother. That should have been my wake-up call. That should have been the moment I realized I was married to someone who would never put me first. But I didn't leave. I made excuses for him. I told myself he would change. I told myself that once we had kids, or once we got older, or once something changed, he would suddenly decide that protecting his marriage mattered more than appeasing his mother. I was working with a therapist years before any of this soup situation happened, and my therapist kept asking me a question I didn't want to answer. "How long are you willing to live like this?" she asked. "How long are you willing to put up with a husband who chooses his mother's needs over yours?" At the time, I thought she was being unreasonable. At the time, I thought she didn't understand our family dynamic, but she was right. She was asking me the most important question, and I was too scared to answer it honestly. The thing is, James wasn't abusive. He wasn't cruel. He never raised his voice at me, or called me names, or controlled my money, or isolated me from my friends. He was just spineless. He was a man who loved his mother so completely that he'd never truly learned how to love his wife. Or maybe he had loved me at some point, but his mother's needs and his mother's opinions and his mother's presence had gradually taken up more and more space in our marriage until there wasn't really room for me anymore. I became an afterthought, a secondary character in the story of his life, rather than the lead. The specific incidents piled up over the years. There was the time Patricia came to our house while I was working and helpfully reorganized my kitchen cabinets, moving everything to places where it didn't make sense and then getting offended when I moved it back. There was the time she told James that she thought I was gaining weight and maybe he should encourage me to exercise more. There was the time she invited herself on a romantic weekend trip James and I had planned, and he said yes without even asking me if I was comfortable with that. There was the time she criticized my cooking in front of his entire extended family, and James just sat there and smiled politely. There were the birthday gifts she'd give me that were clearly meant as criticism, like the expensive face creams Deed Deesig, Ned to address problem skin, or the diet books that appeared under the tree every January. I tried to address these things with James many times. I'd bring them up carefully, gently, trying to explain that his mother's behavior was making me feel disrespected. He would always take her side. He'd say things like, "That's just how she is," or "You know she means well," or my personal favorite, "You're being too sensitive." That phrase became his get-out-of-jail-free card whenever I tried to talk about his mother. I wasn't being too sensitive. I was being hurt, but he didn't want to see that difference. Then there were the moments when Patricia was directly disrespectful in ways that went beyond just being annoying. Like the time she told James, within earshot of me, that she didn't understand why he'd married me when there were so many better options available. Like the time she asked him if he ever regretted his marriage, and when he should have said no, absolutely, he instead said, "Some days." Like the time she commented that I'd never be as good a hostess as she was, and he didn't defend me. He didn't say I was a wonderful hostess. He didn't say that his wife was talented and capable and worthy of respect. He just changed the subject, like she hadn't said anything hurtful. The worst part was that his mother clearly knew she had power over him and wielded it deliberately. She actively enjoyed having dominion over her son's choices. She liked knowing that he would abandon plans with me to help her. She liked knowing that her opinion mattered more than mine. She was a bully, basically, and he was her enabler. I started withdrawing. Not dramatically, not in a way that anyone would notice. But gradually, I stopped trying so hard. I stopped making excuses for him. I stopped rationalizing his behavior. I started watching him more objectively. And what I saw was a man who would never, ever fully commit to me, because a large part of his emotional energy would always belong to his mother. I started thinking about what that meant for my life, what that meant for my future, what that meant for the kind of marriage I'd signed up for versus the kind of marriage I was actually living. By year 10 of our marriage, I developed what I can only describe as an anxiety disorder, specifically related to family gatherings. My stomach would hurt for days before we had to see Patricia and her family. I'd lose sleep. I'd lie awake at night, imagining all the possible ways she might embarrass me, or criticize me, or find some way to make me feel small in front of everyone. And every single time, some version of what I'd imagined would actually happen. Sometimes it was small, like her commenting loudly on how I'd gained weight since she'd seen me last. Sometimes it was medium-sized, like her telling someone at a party that I worked in some boring office job when I was actually a senior marketing director for a major company. But sometimes it was big, and every time it was big, James would make the same excuses. He'd say his mother didn't mean to be hurtful. He'd say she was just speaking her mind. He'd say that I needed to develop thicker skin, that I was too sensitive, that I was taking things too personally. I finally decided to put my foot down about 6 months before the soup incident. I told James that I was tired of putting myself in situations where his mother could hurt me. I told him that if he wanted to go to family events, that was fine, but I wasn't going to do it anymore. I was done spending my weekends feeling anxious and small and disrespected. I was done coming home from family gatherings feeling like I'd been emotionally battered. I was done trying to win the approval of a woman who had made it clear she would never respect me. James had looked genuinely shocked, like the idea that I might have boundaries, that I might refuse to keep showing up for someone who treated me poorly, had never occurred to him. "You can't just opt out of family," he said. "That would hurt my mother's feelings." I looked at him and I said, "Your mother has hurt my feelings for 14 years, and you've never once asked me to consider my feelings in any of this. So no, I don't actually care about hurting her feelings anymore." But then, slowly, he wore me down. He didn't do it deliberately. Or maybe he did. I don't know anymore. He just kept mentioning how much his mother missed me, how she'd asked about me, how she felt like I was pulling away from the family, how hurt she was that I didn't want to come to things anymore. Every single conversation was designed to make me feel guilty for protecting my own mental health. Every single mention of his mother's hurt feelings was an implicit accusation that I was the problem, that I was selfish, that I was driving a wedge between him and his family. He never said those words exactly, but he didn't have to. The subtext was clear, and I broke, because that's what I do. I break. I give in. I decide that my own well-being isn't as important as keeping the peace. I decided that maybe I'd been overreacting. Maybe I was being too sensitive. Maybe Patricia wasn't as bad as I'd convinced myself she was. Maybe things had gotten better. Maybe I could go to one more dinner and it would be fine. Just one more family gathering. Just one more night of putting on the nice outfit and the fake smile and pretending that everything was okay. That Thursday night dinner was supposed to be special. It was Patricia's birthday dinner, and she'd invited the whole family to her house. James had kept emphasizing that it was important to her that I be there, that she specifically asked if I was coming, that she'd been hoping to spend time with me. Looking back now, I wonder if she'd engineered the whole thing, knowing that eventually she could push me to the breaking point. I wonder if she planned out exactly how she was going to hurt me that night, but I'll probably never know for sure. What I do know is that from the moment I arrived at her house, I felt it coming. There was a tension in the air that I could taste, like metal on my tongue. Patricia was overly bright, almost manic in her cheerfulness, greeting everyone at the door with big hugs and loud laughs. She hugged me last, and when she pulled away from the embrace, I could see something in her eyes that looked almost like contempt. She'd made a comment about how nice it was that I could finally make time for family, and her tone made it clear that the compliment was actually an insult. Dinner had been tense from the start. Patricia had seated me as far away from James as possible, at the opposite end of a very long table. She sat James right next to her, where she could touch his arm constantly and lean over to whisper things to him that made him laugh. It was deliberate. Every aspect of the seating arrangement was designed to emphasize that James's loyalty was to her, not to me. Multiple times during the meal, I tried to engage him in conversation, and each time, Patricia would say something to pull his attention back to her. She'd ask him a question about his work, or tell a story about something he'd done as a child, or just put her hand on his arm and say something meant to get a laugh from him. I watched it all happen, and I said nothing. I just sat there and ate the food that Patricia had barely put any effort into preparing, and I smiled at the relatives who were trying to be nice to me, and I felt my soul slowly dying inside my chest. This is what I'd been dreading all these months. This is what I'd known would happen if I came. And I'd come anyway because I was weak, because I couldn't say no to my husband, because I was still trying to please a woman who would never be pleased by anything I did. By the time Patricia brought out the soup course, I was already exhausted. I'd been monitoring every word that came out of my mouth all evening, making sure I didn't say anything that could be twisted into an insult or misinterpreted. I'd been watching James closely, calculating exactly how much attention he was giving to his mother versus how much he was giving to me. I'd been aware of every slight, every comment, every way that Patricia was asserting her dominance in this family dynamic. I was running a constant, internal calculation about whether it was worth staying for dessert, or if I could convince James that we should leave early. So when Patricia stood up to bring out the soup, when she made this big ceremony of it, I was already on edge. When she poured it into the tureen, when she started making this whole thing about how special it was, that she'd made it homemade, I knew something was coming. I could feel it in my bones. The moment she looked at me, I knew. There was something in her expression that was so deliberately mean, so calculated, that for a split second, I thought maybe I was imagining it. Maybe I was being paranoid. Maybe I was projecting my fears onto her face. But then her hand moved, and I watched the motion in slow motion. Watched her arm come back like she was pitching a baseball. Watched her face twist into that ugly sneer. And I heard her say those words, "Try me again." The soup dripped down my chest in rivulets that were cooling, but still hot enough to hurt. Patricia stood there with her hand still extended, the empty tureen hanging from her grip like she couldn't quite believe what she'd done. For a moment, nobody moved, nobody spoke. It was like all the air had been sucked out of the room, and we were all holding our breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Then James moved, and what he did in that moment was the final nail in the coffin of our marriage. He looked away. He actually looked away from his wife, sitting there covered in boiling soup, and he looked down at his plate like nothing had happened, like his mother hadn't just assaulted me in front of 15 people, like I wasn't sitting there with burns blooming across my ribs and my sternum, feeling like they were on fire. "Mom, that was a little much," he said. That was it. That was his entire response to his mother throwing boiling soup on his wife. Not, "Are you okay?" Not, "What the hell is wrong with you?" Not even, "I can't believe you did that." Just a mild rebuke, like she'd been rude at a party instead of committing assault. His aunt made a small sound, something between a gasp and a whimper. His uncle cleared his throat loudly and suddenly became very interested in his salad. Everyone else just sat there, in that same frozen silence, eyes down, pretending that nothing was happening. And I realized in that moment that nobody was going to help me. Not one person at that table was going to stand up and say that what Patricia had done was completely unacceptable. They were all going to sit there and let it happen. And then they were all going to pretend that it hadn't. They were all going to protect her, just like James was protecting her. I stood up slowly, pressing the napkin against my chest, where the soup was still dripping. My hands were shaking, but I kept my voice steady. "I need to clean up. Excuse me." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I didn't make a scene. I just excused myself, like I was leaving to use the bathroom between courses. I think that's what surprised them the most. They probably expected me to cry or scream or create the kind of dramatic scene that would justify all the stories Patricia had been telling about my instability. But I didn't. I walked calmly toward the kitchen, feeling every eye in that room on my back, feeling the weight of their judgment and their relief that I was removing myself from the situation. In the kitchen, I pulled my blouse away from my skin and looked at the damage. My entire chest and stomach were bright red, already starting to blister in places. The burn was going to scar. I could feel it in the intensity of the pain. This wasn't just a minor burn from careless contact with a hot pot. This was deliberate. This was targeted. This was attempted harm. I wet a dish towel with cold water and pressed it against the burns, and I started shaking. Not from the pain, though that was significant. I was shaking from the realization that I had actually been waiting for this moment for years. Some part of me had known it was coming. Some part of me had been standing at the edge of a cliff, waiting to see if I would finally have the courage to jump. Patricia had just pushed me off. I heard footsteps in the hallway, and I tensed, Was James coming to check on me? Was he coming to apologize for his mother, to admit that he'd been wrong all these years, to finally choose me over her? But it wasn't James. It was Patricia's sister, Margaret, who poked her head into the kitchen and asked quietly if I needed anything. She didn't look at the burns. She didn't acknowledge what had happened. She just asked if I needed anything, which was her way of asking me to come back to the table and pretend everything was fine. I told her I was okay and that I'd be back in a moment. She left, and I was alone again with my burns and my rage and the sudden clarity that had replaced years of confusion. That's when I made the decision. Not in anger, though I was angry. Not in panic, though I was panicking. It was almost meditative, the way it came to me. Clear, calm, inevitable. I pulled my phone out of my purse and I called Sarah Chen, the most aggressive family law attorney in the city. I'd gone to her 3 years ago when I was first contemplating what divorce might look like. We'd spent an entire afternoon going over my marriage, analyzing every incident, every disrespect, every moment when I'd been treated like I was less important than a man's relationship with his mother. Sarah had listened to everything, and then she'd told me something I'd needed to hear. "This is emotional abuse," she'd said. "You understand that, right? This isn't just a man who loves his mother too much. This is a man who has been conditioned his entire life to believe that his mother's needs will always come before anyone else's, including his wife's. Unless he fundamentally changes, this won't improve." That was 3 years ago. I'd kept her number in my phone even after I'd decided to try to fix my marriage one more time. Sarah had probably been expecting my call for a while. The phone rang twice before she picked up. Even though it was evening, she answered on the second ring like she'd been waiting. "Sarah," I said, my voice steady despite the pain, "I need you to start divorce proceedings tomorrow morning. My mother-in-law just threw boiling soup on me in front of witnesses. My husband did nothing to stop her. He actually minimized it, said it was a little much. I have documentation of physical injury, and I have at least 15 witnesses who can testify to what happened." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and I could almost hear Sarah recalibrating, could almost see her beginning to calculate the strategy. "Is this something you're certain about?" she asked. "Because once we file, there's no going back from this without significant complications. Your husband will know this is serious. His family will know this is serious. You're going to burn some bridges here." I thought about what that meant. I thought about Patricia, about James, about the extended family that I'd been trying to please for 14 years. I thought about the bridges that were already on fire, that had probably been burning for years without me acknowledging it. "I'm sure," I said. "Can you also contact the police on my behalf and file an assault report? I want this documented officially, not just through civil court." "Absolutely," Sarah said. "Photos? Evidence?" "Photos, yes. I took them in the kitchen about an hour ago. I have the time, the location, the names of witnesses. I'll bring everything tomorrow." "Come in at 8, Sarah said. "We'll get this started immediately. And listen, bring your medical insurance card. You're going to need to go to the emergency room tonight and get these burns documented by a physician. Don't wait until tomorrow. The emergency room can provide medical evidence that's much stronger in court than photos you take yourself." I hung up the phone, and I felt something inside me settle. This was happening. After 14 years of excuses and minimization, and convincing myself that things weren't as bad as I knew they were, I was finally going to do something about it. I was finally going to stop accepting the unacceptable. I was finally going to stop letting a woman I barely respected dictate the terms of my marriage. I spent the next 20 minutes in that kitchen, tending to my burns, which were now blistering badly enough that I knew I should probably go to the emergency room to be checked out. I took photos of the damage with my phone, making sure to get clear images of the extent of the burns. The redness was spreading, the blistering getting worse by the minute. My entire chest area looked like it had been branded. I documented the time, 7:42 p.m. on Thursday, November 14th. I documented the location, Patricia's formal dining room. I wrote down the names of everyone who'd been present. I documented what Patricia had been wearing, the exact words she'd said, the exact tone of her voice when she'd said them. I noted that my husband had been present and had not intervened. I noted that he had, in fact, minimized the incident. I was building a file. I was creating evidence. I was doing what I should have done years ago, which was taking this seriously. I found a roll of plastic wrap in Patricia's kitchen drawer, and I carefully wrapped my chest with it, sealing in the cold compress to help reduce further blistering. It looked ridiculous, like I was some kind of wrapped present, but it helped with the pain. I put my blouse back on over the plastic wrap, hiding the evidence under the fabric where nobody would see it. If I could get through the rest of dinner without anyone realizing how serious the burns were, maybe they wouldn't pressure me to just forget about it and move on. Maybe I could get out of there without having to hear more excuses. I looked at myself in Patricia's kitchen mirror, and I barely recognized the woman staring back at me. There was a hardness in her eyes that hadn't been there this morning. There was a determination, a resolve, something that looked almost like fury, contained in a very small, very controlled package. When I finally went back to the dining room, dessert was being served. James looked at me and smiled, like nothing had happened. "Are you okay?" he asked. And it wasn't a question about my burns. It was a question about whether I was ready to move past this and go back to pretending that his mother's behavior was acceptable. I smiled back at him, and it was a smile that meant the end. He just didn't know it yet. "I'm fine," I said. "Actually, I think I'm better than I've been in years." That night, driving home in the car, with James, making polite conversation like we were coming home from any ordinary dinner, I called my doctor and requested an emergency appointment the next day. I called the hospital and asked about going to the emergency room for the burns, then decided to wait and document everything with my own physician first. I wanted a clear medical record of what Patricia had done. I wanted it on file. I wanted it documented in a way that couldn't be dismissed or minimized or explained away. James asked me why I was making all these phone calls. "Just taking care of some things," I said. He didn't push. He probably thought I was being dramatic, as usual. He probably thought I'd calm down by morning and realize that his mother hadn't meant any harm, that I was overreacting, that I needed to learn how to handle stress better. He probably thought this was just another incident in a long line of incidents that I would eventually let go of. But what James didn't understand was that I wasn't the person I'd been that morning. Something fundamental had shifted inside me. The woman who would absorb abuse and explain it away and convince herself that she was the problem, that woman was gone, and she wasn't coming back. The next morning, I called in sick to work. Sarah had made me an early appointment, and I needed time to document everything before I saw her. I took more photos of the burns, which had spread and deepened overnight. I wrote down a detailed account of what had happened, including the exact words Patricia had said, the exact words my husband had said, the reactions of everyone in the room. I compiled a timeline of all the incidents over the past 14 years. Every disrespect, every boundary violation, every moment when James had chosen his mother over me. I created a document that told the story of my entire marriage, and I laid it all out like evidence in a trial, which I suppose it was going to be. After leaving Patricia's house, I went directly to the emergency room. The staff there took one look at my chest and moved me to the front of the line. The burns had spread significantly and were already showing signs of second-degree damage. The doctor cleaned them, applied medication, wrapped them carefully, and documented everything in my medical record with photographs. He asked me how I'd gotten these burns, and I told him the truth. My mother-in-law had thrown boiling soup on me. He wrote it down. He documented it as an intentional assault. He gave me a discharge summary that laid out the severity of the injury and my treatment. This was evidence. This was documentation that couldn't be disputed or explained away. When I got to Sarah's office the next morning, I was wearing a loose shirt that didn't touch the bandages. I had the emergency room paperwork, the photos I'd taken, my detailed account of what had happened, and the names of everyone who'd been present. Sarah took one look at the medical documentation and the emergency room photographs, and she swore under her breath. "This is textbook assault," she said. "Intentional infliction of emotional distress, possibly even attempted bodily harm. I'm filing a police report today, and I'm starting divorce proceedings immediately. Given the severity of the incident and the number of witnesses, we can absolutely file for a temporary restraining order against your mother-in-law." She pulled out a legal pad and started making notes. "Here's what we're going to do. First, I'm calling the district attorney's office and providing them with everything you have. Second, I'm filing for an emergency protective order that will be issued immediately, even before a hearing. This will prohibit your mother-in-law from contacting you, coming near your home, coming near your workplace. Third, I'm preparing the divorce petition, but we're not filing it yet. We're going to wait until after the police have documented her statement, and she realizes this is real. I told her I wanted everything. I wanted to make sure that James and Patricia both understood that this behavior had consequences, that my kindness wasn't an invitation for them to treat me like garbage, that I was no longer someone who would absorb their dysfunction and smile about it. Sarah nodded approvingly. "You're doing the right thing," she said. "Most people in your situation make excuses. They tell themselves it wasn't that bad, that they should just move on, that pressing charges is too vindictive. But what your mother-in-law did is a crime, and your husband's failure to protect you and his minimization of her behavior is exactly the kind of thing that makes men like him dangerous. He's already demonstrated that he'll side with his mother even when his wife is being physically harmed. That tells you everything you need to know about what your marriage would look like going forward." Sarah filed the paperwork that afternoon. By evening, the police were calling to ask if I wanted to press charges for assault. I said yes. By morning, they'd sent an officer to my house to take a formal statement. I showed him the photos, told him the story, answered his questions about what had happened and why I was pressing charges now instead of immediately after the incident. He was sympathetic, but professional. "This was simple assault," he explained. "And with this many witnesses and the physical evidence, it would likely result in charges being filed against Patricia." James came home that night, and everything felt different. The house felt different. He felt different to me. Or maybe I was different, and the house and the man were just reflecting that difference back at me. "What happened today?" he asked. He could sense something had shifted, even if he didn't understand what it was. "I went to see my lawyer," I said, And I filed a police report against your mother for assault. I'm also filing for divorce." He stared at me, like I'd spoken in a language he didn't understand. "What?" he said. "You can't do that." "Watch me," I said, and I meant it. By the end of that day, Patricia had been contacted by the police. By the end of the next day, she'd hired her own attorney. By the end of the week, she was furious. She called James repeatedly, demanding that I drop the charges, that I apologize for making a false report, that I admit that I'd actually caused my own burns somehow. She claimed that she'd been protecting herself from me, that I'd been aggressive, that she'd just been defending herself. The story kept changing, depending on who she was telling it to and what she thought would stick. James begged me to reconsider. He called me from work, his voice desperate. "My mother could go to jail," he said. "I know," I said. "That's the point." He tried to get me to see his perspective, to understand that this was just a misunderstanding that had gotten blown out of proportion. He tried to convince me that pressing charges was a step too far, that a simple apology would be enough, but an apology that Patricia had never offered, and one that James had never insisted she give me. He tried appealing to my emotions, saying that his sister was embarrassed, that his extended family was talking about me, that this was going to destroy the family. "Your mother already destroyed the family," I said. "She destroyed it the moment she decided that hurting me was acceptable. She destroyed it the moment she looked at your face, your own son, and decided that assaulting your wife in front of 15 witnesses wasn't going to bother her. She destroyed it the moment she assumed that you would never do anything to stop her, because she's been right about that your entire life. I'm not destroying the family. I'm just finally refusing to be destroyed by it." The police investigation moved quickly. With that many witnesses, it was straightforward. Patricia had thrown boiling soup on me. It didn't matter that she tried to claim self-defense. It didn't matter that she tried to say I'd done something to provoke her. The physical evidence, the medical documentation, the witness statements, they all told the same story. On a Tuesday morning, 2 weeks after the incident, Patricia was arrested. The police officers came to her house in the morning. James got a call from his sister, who'd been present at the arrest, describing how their mother had been handcuffed in front of the neighbors, how she'd been taken to the police station, how she was now facing assault charges that could result in jail time. He came home that evening looking like a man whose entire world had collapsed, which I suppose it had. Everything he'd built his identity on, everything he'd constructed around his relationship with his mother, it was all falling apart. "We can fix this," he said, like it was a problem that could be solved with enough effort and the right words. But it wasn't a problem to be fixed anymore. It was a consequence to be faced. His mother had crossed a line, and I'd stopped being kind enough to pretend it didn't matter. "We can't," I said. "It's done. The charges have been filed. Your mother will have to face the consequences of her actions, just like I'm going to have to face the consequences of mine, which include ending our marriage." He asked me if there was anything he could do to stop the divorce. I told him no. I told him that he'd had 14 years to choose me, to stand up for me, to put his wife before his mother, and every single time he'd chosen differently. Now he was going to have to live with what that meant. The restraining order came through the following week. Patricia was prohibited from coming within 500 yards of my home or my workplace. She was prohibited from contacting me directly. She was prohibited from contacting me through any intermediaries. She was prohibited from coming near me in any location. The legal system had done what my husband had never been willing to do. It had protected me from someone who was willing to hurt me. The charges were filed officially, and Patricia's court date was set for a month out. In the meantime, she was attempting to negotiate a settlement, trying to get me to agree to drop the charges in exchange for various concessions. Sarah told her that there was nothing to negotiate. This had moved beyond civil matters into criminal territory. Patricia had committed a crime, and the consequences were no longer something I could choose to forgive away. But what Patricia didn't understand was that the consequences weren't going to stop with criminal charges. She'd crossed a line, and the legal system wasn't the only thing that was going to hold her accountable. The moment she'd thrown that soup on me in front of 15 witnesses, she'd set a series of events in motion that would touch every part of her life in ways she probably couldn't have imagined. Within a week of her arrest, the story had spread through our community like a wildfire that nobody could contain, no matter how hard people tried to minimize it or explain it away. Social media posts started appearing, people who'd been at that dinner sharing what they'd witnessed, describing how Patricia had assaulted me in graphic detail and how my own husband had done nothing to stop her, had in fact minimized what she'd done. At first, these posts were sympathetic to me, asking if I was okay, if I needed anything, if there was any way they could support me. But as more people commented and shared and discussed, the narrative shifted. People started bringing up other incidents they'd heard about. Moments when Patricia had been cruel to servers at restaurants, when she'd been dismissive to people she considered beneath her, when she'd displayed this casual cruelty that had apparently been part of her character for years. One woman commented that Patricia had reduced her to tears at a charity event once, questioning her intelligence in front of a group of people. Another said Patricia had made a racist joke at a dinner party and then acted like everyone else was overreacting when someone called her out on it. Her book club dropped her. The women she'd been meeting with for over a decade decided they didn't want to be associated with someone facing assault charges. They sent her a formal letter explaining that they were concerned about the well-being of the group and that they thought it was best if she took a break from attending. It was as polite as a firing squad could be, and it made the statement that she was now toxic, that her presence brought down everyone around her. Her church asked her to step back from her volunteer position working with the women's ministry. The church leadership was careful to make it clear they weren't making any judgment about her guilt or innocence, but they had a responsibility to protect the community and blah, blah, blah. What they meant was that having someone facing assault charges, leading women's ministry, was a problem they didn't need. She went from being the woman who organized the church events to being the woman that everyone whispered about when she walked into a room. Her lawyer kept calling, trying to work out some kind of settlement with Sarah. He suggested that if I agreed to drop the charges and accept a civil settlement, Patricia would agree to pay for my medical bills and perhaps some additional compensation for the emotional distress. It was insulting in its transparency. Patricia was trying to buy her way out of consequences. She thought that if she just paid me enough money, I'd make this all go away, and she could return to her life like nothing had happened. But that wasn't how this worked. That wasn't how I was going to let this work. I told Sarah to reject every offer. I didn't care if Patricia offered me $100,000 or $1 million. I didn't want her money. I wanted her to understand that there were consequences for the choices she made, that she couldn't just treat people badly and then make it disappear with a check and an apology. The court date came on a cold Tuesday in December. James and I sat on opposite sides of the courtroom, and it was the strangest thing, being in the same room with him while being completely separated by the actions that had happened between us. He looked smaller somehow, like the weight of everything that had transpired had physically diminished him. He'd lost weight, and his face had a grayness to it that made him look like a man who hadn't been sleeping well. Maybe he hadn't. Maybe he was finally beginning to understand what his choices had cost him. Patricia was wearing a navy suit, the same suit she'd worn to that office meeting years ago, back when she was trying to convince me I was losing my mind. She looked terrified now. The confident woman who'd been certain that she could manipulate me into silence was gone. In her place was a woman facing the reality that her victim wasn't going to go away quietly, wasn't going to disappear, wasn't going to let her pretend that nothing had happened. She kept glancing at her lawyer, like she expected him to somehow make this all go away with the right argument, the right explanation. But there was no explanation. There was no argument that could change what had happened. The prosecutor presented the case with a clinical efficiency. The medical documentation, the witness statements, the police report, all of it laid out like evidence at a crime scene. This wasn't complicated. Patricia had thrown boiling soup on me. She'd done it intentionally. She'd done it in front of witnesses. She'd done it with full knowledge of what she was doing and the consequences it would cause. The prosecutor showed photographs of the burns, the blistering, the damage that had taken weeks to heal. He showed the emergency room report. He called witness after witness, people who'd been sitting at that table, people who'd seen what happened and couldn't deny it, no matter how much Patricia wished they would. Patricia's lawyer tried the defense that she'd been defending herself, that I'd been aggressive toward her, that the incident had been provoked. But when the prosecutor asked him to provide even a shred of evidence that I'd done anything that would warrant her throwing soup, there was nothing. Patricia had thrown soup because she was angry that I'd finally stopped accepting her behavior. She'd thrown soup because I'd spoken up. She'd thrown soup because she was used to people backing down when she got aggressive. And I hadn't. The judge looked unimpressed by the defense strategy. When he rendered his verdict, he found Patricia guilty of assault. The sentence was 60 days in jail, 6 months of probation, and mandatory anger management counseling. It wasn't prison for years, like in the criminal cases you see on television, but it was real. It meant that Patricia was going to jail, that for 2 months she was going to know what it felt like to have her freedom taken away. I watched her face when the judge announced the sentence. In that moment, she realized that buying her way out hadn't worked, that manipulating her way out hadn't worked, that all her attempts to control the narrative had failed. Her mouth opened slightly. Her hand gripped the edge of the table. She looked at her lawyer with a desperation that was almost painful to see. When they led her away, she looked at me one more time, and I saw something I hadn't seen before. Not rage, not defiance, not the calm certainty that she was right. I saw fear. I saw understanding that she'd finally met someone who wouldn't back down, someone willing to let the consequences fall where they would. That look was worth more than any apology she could have offered. The divorce proceedings moved quickly after that. James tried repeatedly to get me to reconsider, to meet with a marriage counselor, to give our relationship another chance now that his mother was finally facing consequences. He seemed to believe that by removing Patricia from our lives, the rest of our marriage problems would magically resolve themselves. But that wasn't how this worked. Patricia wasn't the problem with our marriage. Patricia was a symptom of the problem. The problem was James. The problem was a man who had chosen his mother over his wife, who had minimized his mother's assault on me, who had been willing to let me be hurt rather than stand up to his mother. I explained this to him one final time, when we sat across from each other in Sarah's office to review the settlement. He was going to have to accept the reality that our marriage was over, that I was done, that there were no circumstances under which I was going to wake up tomorrow and decide that being married to him was worth the cost to my own mental health and physical safety. He cried, actually cried, looking at me across the desk with tears running down his face, begging me to reconsider. He told me that he understood what he'd done wrong, that he was going to get therapy, that he was going to work on his relationship with his mother, that everything was going to be different. But different in what way? Different because he'd finally learned his lesson after I'd had to throw boiling soup, file assault charges, and hire the most aggressive attorney in the city. Different because I'd had to make an example out of his mother to teach him that I was serious. That wasn't different. That was just consequences. And I was done being kind enough to let him avoid them. The settlement was straightforward. I kept the house. He got half of our joint assets, which wasn't particularly generous, but it was what the law required. I received alimony for 3 years, which meant he was going to be paying me every single month, a reminder of what his choices had cost him. He was going to be writing checks with my name on them, and every time he did, he was going to remember that he'd had the choice to stand up for me, and he'd chosen his mother instead. I didn't feel particularly satisfied by the financial terms. Money had never been the point. The point was that he was finally going to have to understand that his wife had mattered more than his mother, and he'd blown that opportunity. The extended family had fractured in ways that surprised even me. His sister, who'd been present at that dinner, called me the day after the court verdict. She apologized for her silence that night, told me she should have said something immediately instead of sitting there like everyone else and pretending it hadn't happened. She said she respected what I'd done, that she was proud of me for not backing down, that she was ashamed of her mother and ashamed of her brother for enabling her behavior. She told me that she was struggling with what it meant that her mother was now in jail, that her mother was a convicted criminal, that her mother had done something so bad that a judge had agreed it warranted incarceration. She was working through it, she said, and she hoped that someday we could maintain some kind of relationship, but she understood if I didn't want to. I appreciated her acknowledgement, but I also knew that she'd been sitting at that table when Patricia threw the soup. She'd been silent when my husband minimized what she'd done. And silence in the face of assault is its own choice. I told her that I was glad she was thinking about what had happened, but that I needed time before I could consider any kind of relationship. She accepted that, and we left things there. Other family members took Patricia's side, which I suppose I should have expected. Her brother defended her constantly, showing up at every single court hearing with letters from people testifying to her character. He didn't seem to understand that character witnesses couldn't change the fact that she'd thrown boiling soup on me in front of 15 people. Her sister started a fund to help pay for her legal fees, which was technically legal, but which felt like a statement about where people's loyalties lay. James's uncle, who'd been at that dinner, actually approached me at a coffee shop 3 weeks after the verdict to tell me that I'd been too harsh on his sister-in-law, that she was suffering enough without the added humiliation of jail time. I told him that she was suffering the natural consequences of her own actions, and that if he was concerned about her well-being, he could start by holding her accountable instead of making excuses for her. But there were also people who came to me privately and told me they were grateful that I'd stood up, that they'd been victims of similar behavior and had never been brave enough to do what I'd done. A woman from James's work approached me after the divorce was finalized, and told me that she'd been assaulted by her own mother-in-law years ago and had just accepted it. Hearing about what I'd done gave her the courage to tell her husband that if it ever happened again, she would leave him immediately. She said that my refusal to be treated like a victim had shown her that she didn't have to accept being treated like one either. That was worth something. That was worth more than Patricia's apologies ever could have been. The community's perception of me had shifted dramatically. I'd gone from being James's unstable wife who misunderstood family dynamics to being that woman who pressed charges against her mother-in-law. The narrative had changed, and I was no longer the problem in everyone's eyes. People nodded at me at the grocery store. Women at my own book club complimented me on my courage. The pastor at church told me he was impressed by my strength. It was strange, being seen as strong rather than being pitied as weak, being respected rather than being whispered about. Patricia served her 60 days. She was released on a rainy Friday in February, and the first thing she did was try to violate the restraining order by calling James. He reported it to her probation officer, which I'm sure she appreciated, and she ended up with additional probation requirements. It seemed like she was determined to learn this lesson the hard way, to keep pushing until she finally understood that there were people she couldn't manipulate, situations she couldn't charm her way out of, consequences she couldn't avoid. I saw her once, about 8 months after her release, at the grocery store. We were in the produce section, and I was choosing apples when I noticed her frozen at the far end of the aisle, staring at me. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then she turned and walked quickly away, heading for the checkout without finishing her shopping. She couldn't even handle being in the same room with me without leaving. That's when I realized how completely the dynamics had shifted. I wasn't afraid of her anymore, and she was terrified of me, not because I'd threatened her or because I had any intention of hurting her, but because she finally understood that I was capable of holding her accountable, that I wasn't going to let her hurt me and walk away like it didn't matter, that I was willing to let the legal system do what needed to be done. Sorry. James tried to maintain some kind of relationship with me during the divorce process, kept showing up at places he knew I'd be, kept calling with various excuses about needing to discuss things. After the divorce was finalized, I told Sarah to send him a cease and desist letter. I didn't want him calling me. I didn't want him appearing at my grocery store, or my gym, or my favorite restaurant. I wanted him completely out of my life. The letter was effective. He stopped appearing, and when he called, I didn't answer. After the third or fourth unreturned call, he seemed to accept that it was really over. Last I heard from mutual acquaintances, he'd moved to another state, trying to get a fresh start away from all of this. I hope he learned something from the experience. I hope he understands now that choosing your mother over your wife is a choice that has consequences. That being loyal to family doesn't mean accepting abuse. That being kind doesn't mean being a doormat. As for me, I've rebuilt my life in the time since the divorce was finalized, choosing what I wanted to rebuild and what I wanted to leave behind. I'm living in the house that I fought to keep in the settlement, and it feels different now, like it belongs to me again. I've redecorated it completely, removing the furniture that felt like it belonged to someone else's life, choosing new decorations that reflect only what I love. I've taken a promotion at work that I'd been afraid to pursue while I was married, worried about what James would think. I've joined a hiking club and traveled to places I'd always wanted to go. I've said yes to opportunities instead of checking with someone else first. There's no James to consult anymore. There's no Patricia to disapprove of my choices. There's just me, and the freedom to decide what my life is going to look like going forward. I've started dating again, slowly, carefully, with much higher standards than I had before. I'm not going to make the mistake of overlooking red flags just because someone seems nice or because I want to believe that love is enough to fix fundamental problems. I'm looking for someone who will stand up for me, who will prioritize me, who will be willing to protect me if someone tries to hurt me. I'm looking for the exact opposite of what I had with James. The scars on my chest have faded considerably, but they haven't disappeared entirely. I can still see them if I look for them. Faint lines that remind me of that night at Patricia's table. They're a reminder of what I was willing to endure and what I finally decided I wouldn't endure anymore. Some people look at them and ask what happened, and I tell them the truth. I tell them about the boiling soup and the assault charge and the conviction. I tell them about my husband who couldn't stand up to his mother. And then I tell them about the day I decided I was done being kind to people who were determined to treat me like garbage. I tell them about making one phone call that changed everything. I tell them about learning the difference between strength and kindness, between love and codependency, between loyalty and blindness. Sarah and I have stayed in touch. She sends me Christmas cards. She tells me that my case has become something of a legend in her office. The story of how a woman finally stood up to her abuser instead of making excuses for her. She uses my story to explain to other clients why they don't have to accept what's being done to them, why pressing charges or filing for divorce or involving the authorities doesn't make them vindictive or dramatic or too harsh. It makes them someone who is finally willing to protect themselves. She tells me that because of what I did, other women have found the courage to do the same thing. They've called her office. They've told her that my story gave them the strength they needed. That's the most valuable thing that came out of all of this. Not the financial settlement, not the conviction, not the restraining order. It's knowing that my refusal to accept unacceptable behavior has made it easier for other people to refuse the same. The last time I saw James was at the grocery store, about 2 years after the divorce was finalized. He looked older than he should have at his age, like the experience had worn something essential out of him. He started to approach me, probably to say hello or to see if I'd soften toward him, but then he seemed to think better of it. He nodded at me from a distance and then turned away. I didn't feel sadness at seeing him. I didn't feel anger. I felt nothing but the distant acknowledgement that I'd been married to that man once and that I'd made the right choice in leaving him. That was more closure than I'd expected. Patricia ended up moving out of state to live with her sister, trying to escape the reputation she'd built in our community. She couldn't go to her book club, couldn't go to her church events, couldn't go to the grocery store without wondering if she was going to run into me. So she left. I heard through the grapevine that she was struggling with anger management, that she'd had several incidents where she'd been aggressive toward people in her new community, that she was becoming increasingly isolated. I didn't feel sorry for her. She'd made her choices, and now she was living with them. She'd told me that I wasn't family anymore, told me to stay out of her life, thrown boiling soup on me, and assumed I would just accept it. And when I didn't, when I actually held her accountable for her actions, she crumbled. She couldn't handle it. That night at her table, when she'd looked at me and sneered, "Try me again," she'd meant it as a threat. She'd meant it as a warning that she was dangerous, that I needed to back down, that I needed to learn my place. But I took it as an invitation. I took it as exactly what I needed to finally stop accepting unacceptable behavior. And when I did try her again, when I actually stood up to her and held her accountable, it turned out that she didn't have as much power as she thought. The system was on my side. The law was on my side, and most importantly, I was on my side. I was finally willing to protect myself, and that made all the difference. I learned that being strong doesn't mean being cruel. It means knowing when you're worth fighting for. And I was finally worth it.